Hello, Siegfried here. Today's question is, how do Japanese see American culture? This question comes to me from my friend Tracy. I do have some insights into this, but before I start, I want to say that in my experience, there is no one way, of course, that Japanese people view American culture. There are a number of different stereotypes, but you meet different people, they're going to have different levels of experience with American culture, and they're going to have very different views about it. So, what I'm going to share comes from my individual experience with individual Japanese people while teaching them English. And often, in the way the kinds of English teaching that I do involves a lot of personal conversation. They ask me a lot of questions about America, and I like to share a lot of information about America and American culture. So, that's where this comes from. It's going to represent the views of individual people that I've talked to. But in all of these cases, these are things that are pretty common themes that come up. So, let's start with the first one. And that's work culture in America. Japanese people see work culture in America as being a place where you can be more ambitious, that you can chart your own course for your career, that you can make a lot of money if you work really hard, and where you don't need to be quite so much of a team player as you do in Japan. Now, in Japan, they have a strict hierarchy. There's a lot more emphasis on seniority within a company. Japanese companies hire people out of college almost irrespective sometimes of what they actually studied in college. You can end up being a software programmer in a Japanese company even if you never studied programming in college, for instance. They hire you, you may have done something else, and they're like, you know what, we need programmers. We think you can go learn, so they send you to go learn that. They send people to business school sometimes. They change people's careers. It's more a question of what the company needs, and then they look at their people and they're like, who can best give us this? So it is a very different culture than in America, where basically you market yourself as, I'm a person who does this. If you need a person like me, look at me and pick the best one. So it's a real different kind of environment, and people who don't like what can be a very stifling system in Japan where they have very little individual control, they're really interested in working in America because they feel like the work culture is going to be different. And I think in this case, they're probably right about that. All right, next up. In America, I think Japanese people perceive that there are less social obligations on each individual person, and this allows more freedom of expression and freedom of individuality. In America, you can feel more free to be yourself, to be a little bit different than other people, with a less opportunity that you'll be judged or ostracized for the differences that you express. Now, I think that this is maybe a little bit less common expression. Not a lot of people have said this to me directly. It's more something that I've inferred both from their behavior and sort of wistful ideas of what a life might be like in America and their perception of American media. But I think there's some truth to it, but there's a lot of individuality in Japan and a lot of really interesting expression that happens in society. It just seems to happen through specific channels. People are more reserved about their individuality on a day-to-day basis, but it's still there. I think Americans, in turn, have this perception that Japanese people are kind of crushed down and made to be just like everybody else. It's true on a face level, but when you get closer to people like we do in these individual English lessons, there's a huge variety in Japanese people about their attitudes and their emotions, just like anywhere else in the world. So I think that's really just more about the way we act in public at a default level. All right, next up. This is a common perception. America is kind of dangerous. Now, they don't always say, oh, America is very dangerous. They ask me, is it dangerous for me to go to America? If I go to Los Angeles, do I need to be careful? Are there places I shouldn't go? I generally tell them, no, America is mostly not dangerous. It's pretty rare that you're going to come into any kind of physical danger. I tell them to beware of being scammed because anybody who doesn't speak the language especially well is a little bit vulnerable to someone trying to, get a little bit of money out of them or overcharge them for something. But generally speaking, I tell them they don't need to be very afraid unless they go into very specific places or just make big mistakes. I tell them that there is a lot of violence in America compared to Japan, which is true, but a lot of it originates from being, gang violence or domestic violence among families or something like this, and that they're not likely to run into that unless they try to get involved in criminal behavior or something like that, which I would say to people who come to Japan. Japan is incredibly safe. unless you decide to try and buy drugs or you want to go to somewhere where they have prostitution or something like that. You might run into some unsavory characters. I think America is pretty similar. It's just that there's a little bit more violence, especially surrounding the drug trade, etc. But that's a common perception people have, and they see the school shootings. That kind of stuff doesn't happen in Japan. And so, rightly so, to some degree, they see America as a more violent and a little bit more dangerous place. I think that's true. Japan happens to be one of the safest places in the world, so by comparison, that's the way things will look. Another thing that they very commonly perceive from America is that we eat tons of food, and that when you go to a restaurant, you're going to get an enormous amount of food. There is, again, some truth to that. I tell them, I show them pictures of big gulps from 7-Eleven. Their eyes bug out because, yes, indeed, we get these huge soda drinks and things. You don't find that in Japan. If you go get a drink, it's generally going to be much smaller. But the actual food portions here, not really that different. And I tell them, it's maybe a little bit bigger. There are certain restaurants famous for giving you a lot of food. But by and large, you go to McDonald's, the food is the same size. You get about the same amount, except for drinks, which are much larger in America. There's a general perception that America is pretty wealthy. People have big houses. They've got a lot of money. Again, I think that's true to a degree. America is a little bit wealthier nation than Japan. People individually, on average, are a little bit wealthy. In Japan, space is at a premium. You don't see giant McMansions everywhere. People are a little bit more modest in their living style. They're used to smaller apartments and smaller houses, things like that. There's definitely ostentation shows of wealth here as well. Plenty of very, very wealthy people in Japan, but the way that it's expressed is a little bit different. Finally, I would say one perception, again, this is not explicit, but something that comes out in conversation. People in Japan see America as kind of one thing, and I think as I've described before, being in Japan gives me a perspective that America is a lot more diversified than it appears from the inside. Japan is a smaller country. It's got a more homogenous culture. It's not completely homogenous by any stretch, but compared to America, it is more so. And people from Japan don't see the political divides and the social divides and the regional differences in language and the regional differences in culture that we have in America. There's quite a lot of that. And that's just something that they're not so aware of. And it's something that I really try to share with them through talking about my travels in different places in the US. I share with them different US accents and ways that language is used, especially when they ask, how's the correct way to pronounce this word? I tell them, well, different parts of America, we say it different ways. So you can choose which one is best, or you can copy me if you want to, but there's not just one way to do it. All right, so those are some pretty common perceptions of Japanese people hold about American culture based on my personal experience. And please keep in mind, I see a specific subset of somewhat wealthier Japanese people who have the money to invest in private English tutoring. And these are people who are usually often very interested in America. Some of them have lived in America before, so they have firsthand experience. So it's a particular subset. I can't speak about other Japanese people who don't speak English because I can't really communicate with them very well. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that and it sparked some interesting ideas for you. And we'll see you next time. Hey, maybe if you're an American, share with some of your perceptions about what you think Japan is like, and I'll respond to that.